Hi there, Don fans. Ian here with another Don the Stats special episode. Even without the club outright coming out and saying it, I think it's clear to all and sundry that Essendon is currently in a rebuild and has been for a couple of years now. That choice comes with a variety of challenges, not least of which is a challenging on-field environment, a ravenous media pack, and frustrated fans who have waited too long for success. Joining me tonight to talk about where Essendon is at currently in the rebuilding cycle and where things go from here is Tommy Wolfe. Tommy is an Essendon fan who thinks deeply about the game and explores ideas with a lot of nuance and pathos in his blog, Reading the Play. He's put out multiple articles this year exploring where the Bombers are at, and he's graciously given up some of his time to join me tonight. Tommy, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Love your show and glad to be here.
Oh, we love your work here too. And when I mentioned in the Patreon chat that you were coming on the show, there was considerable excitement. I think particularly over the past year, people have come to really enjoy your writing and your work, and they're looking forward to hearing from you tonight. I guess before we get into the meat and potatoes of what we're doing, just a bit of background on you. What's your connection to Essendon? Your favourite players, your favourite moments? Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a good one. My dad's a migrant from Croatia. He came here when he was 21, so knew nothing about football. And the house that the family that looked after him when he moved here initially until he got on his feet, they had a young boy who was about 10 or 11, I think, and he was a mad Bombers fan. So my dad, as a non-English speaking foreigner, learnt about football through this 10-year-old's love of the Essendon Football Club. And he developed the same love for that club. And then obviously he met my mum and we were born as kids, and my mum's into football. So it was Bombers or nothing in our house. So that's sort of how the Bombers love started. And I'm very fortunate that my partner's also a Bomber, so our kids get no choice. We had one who tried a brief dalliance with the dogs because he's got a few dogs friends at school, but that quickly came to a head when he realised that we wouldn't be going to any dogs games. In terms of the question about favourite players, it made me really think about this because it's been so long since we've had like a megastar at Essendon. Like we've had some nice players, some good players, but when I think about my favourite players, it's my early memories of the Bombers. So James Hird and Matthew Lloyd were my favourites as a kid. And then it's really hard to think of players who are of that level ever since. So that's a disappointing thing. I think probably now, if I think about it, there's some flash in the pan plays. You know, a Jason Winderlich who was so injury impacted, but I love the way he went about it when he was up and going. I loved Spike McVeigh, his passion and his hardness, and combination of that with his skill was something I really enjoyed. Hurley and Heppel, I think, as more modern players, are players that I really enjoyed watching when they were at their best. I think injury robbed them of their best as well. And I think today, now, having watched the draft in recent years, I actually am a really big fan of our young players. So, I love Sully Roby and I love Dyson Sharp, and I think Nate Caddy's so exciting. So I think our young brigade at the moment probably are the ones that are really triggering me.
Yeah, I think it's sort of what's sustaining a lot of Essendon fans at the moment, sort of thinking about what could be. And as you sort of say, we've got some glimpses of what they can do. Obviously, Nate Caddy is doing really well as a number one target forward in a team that is struggling. And Sullivan Roby is standing up in the middle up against players as good as Patrick Cripps and not looking out of place. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be excited about, but it gives also, little specks of light in what has been a pretty deep, dark time. If you're an Essendon fan, it keeps extending, and it seems like the light is getting further and further away, but it will turn one day, fingers crossed, before we're all in old folks' homes and can barely remember anything. I guess, as I said, the main reason I got you on is because of your work through your Reading the Play blog. I guess just a bit of background on that. How long have you been doing it? What inspired you to set it up? And what are you trying to achieve with the writing that you do there?
Yeah, thank you for asking about it. I love footy and I love writing. I think, it's a nice combination that I get a space where I can do that. I did a little stint for the now discontinued Footy Prophet back in, must have been 2018. And little did I know they were probably about to discontinue their written website just after I started, because I think I got through 3 or 4 articles and they shut down. But that had sort of lit the fire in me to write about footy. So I sort of went my own way then and started Reading the Play back in 2019. But I probably didn't know enough about getting traction or generating readers. It was sort of very early, my first foray into social media, so I wasn't really an expert in how to sort of spread my writing. So I didn't get much traction. You get 50 reads on an article and you knew that 39 were your family and friends, and they shared it with 10 of their friends, and that was it. So it kind of fizzled out pretty quick. And then COVID happened and obviously priorities changed and life became pretty hectic. So the website went dormant and I got busy, and we've had quite a few kids since then. And so my life is pretty hectic at the best of times. But in the last couple of years, I found myself watching the under-18s, obviously Essendon being pretty average in recent times. The draft was a focus, and there's probably a gap in the way the draft is covered. So I thought, well, I love writing about footy. I can probably write about the draft, and I could probably write about these kids and get some exposure out there from that and share some ideas around phantom drafts and power rankings and that sort of stuff. So I just dipped my toe into that, and the draft is what people love. And so there was just a really immediate uptake in people wanting to read about it and share my work. And it went from being, 38 of my family and friends to quite a few people who I didn't know commenting on it and sharing it and spreading it. And then you find out that the social media algorithm does its thing and people liked what I was doing. And then because I had generated a little bit of readership, and I'm by no means a big fish, I'm a very, very small operator in a very, very niche market, it gave me a vehicle to share some other stuff. And because I love writing about football, it gave me a vehicle to share some of my thoughts and ideas on the game. And so I've been back at it since last September. So it's been almost a year back at it, and I'm really loving it. I'm trying to sort of maintain a cycle of about an article a week, generally around an issue or topic in the game. If there's no real topical issue that I feel strongly about, it's maybe a player piece or a why I love the game kind of piece. But in amongst all that, I've got my draft sort of following going, and I love watching the underage footy. I've done some talent ID training, and I love that side of the industry. I love list building. So where possible, I try and sort of spread some of the knowledge I've got in that and share some of those rankings and content around the draftees and what list builds might look like for several clubs. So that's kind of what it is. It's a passion project. There's no goal at this point. I'm not putting a ceiling on it. If it keeps growing the way it has in the last sort of 9 months or so, that'd be amazing. And if it goes somewhere beyond what it is now, then brilliant. But otherwise, I love footy and I love writing, and it's given me an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and you certainly do a great job at it. I think it's one of the great things about the internet and about social media is the democratization of opinion and of ideas, and being able to find different avenues for people to explore different concepts and different aspects of football, and for people to find people who think similarly to them or may even challenge the way that they do. And I think for the most part, at least from my experience doing it as well, it's been mostly positive. I mean, we're not talking about politics here, so you don't get the AI bots brigading you when you post something, but most of the time you sort of find the people that are interested in hearing what you have to say, and you form your own little community and things along those lines. And if you don't like what someone else is doing, you're not forced to read it or watch it. It's not, I guess with the mainstream media, you were limited to certain opinions and who they chose to platform. And that had its benefits, but it also had its drawbacks. And I think we're in a really good spot at the moment with the amount of people out there, sharing ideas and sharing material and talking about football in different ways. And I think in many ways it's made the fan bases and the followers of football a bit more informed across a variety of different ways and ways in which football plays out.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, you look at what you guys do with your show, there's such a dearth of quality content explaining to fans what's actually happening. People look at stats and they talk about disposal efficiency or they talk about contested ball, but the understanding of what those things actually mean is so poorly demonstrated by the mainstream media. So for guys like you to put shows out that really go through, well, what does it actually mean when we talk about differentials, and what does it mean when we talk about these kind of statistical analysis of the game? I think, there's so much more opportunity for people to share that kind of information. And I'm a very, very small part of that. And I think it's great. And you mentioned before people opinions and disagree, agree. I love the discussion around football. I love football, like at its core, and there's issues with the game and there's issues with being an Essendon fan and there's all that. But at its core, I just love football and I love hearing what people think about it. I don't agree with a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of people don't agree with me, but I think that discourse around the game and what it is and what it entails is really, I suppose it enlivens me and it makes me really curious to know more, and it makes me curious why people see that way or why they view a player a certain way. And I love the conversation. And, on X, you get some people who are very argumentative, and that's cool. I get that. But there's also a whole community of people who are willing to share opinions and discuss and push back and challenge you, but in a respectful way. And I feel like my intent is to go the same way back. And I think that furthers not only the conversation, but it certainly furthers my understanding of the game and my understanding of the reasons why I actually love it.
Yeah, indeed. I certainly am a lot more interested in football in general from doing this and engaging with, people like yourself and other people that have done through this. I just did, getting to know people like Rick Edwards and stuff like that. It gives you a whole range of different perspectives on football, and I really appreciate it. Well, look, I actually reached out to you a couple of weeks back just after the Richmond loss, and I think we were probably messaging that initial message back and forth, right, when the board was meeting to sack Brad Scott. And then the day after we agreed to do an episode, it was announced that Brad Scott was sacked. I actually been sort of working up the courage to ask you to come on, mainly after your Hold the Line article. We compared where Essendon was at to Richmond's long build up to the 2017 premiership success. And I think up until that day that we started messaging, there was a clear alignment that Essendon was holding to a long-term plan. And now they have blinked it and sacked the coach, which sort of went against what you said in the article. But I think just before we get on to the decision to let go of Brad Scott, let's start where you think Essendon was at in its list build and long-term strategy before that choice was made. Thinking of best case scenarios, I guess if you could think about where do you place Essendon at the moment in terms of its list build and its strategy compared to successful teams of the past like a Richmond or Hawthorn. So, for example, you might think that Essendon is where Richmond was at in 2011, just for an example, or that might not be accurate, but again, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, firstly, I'd say I was a big fan of the direction to go down the drafting pathway. I think Essendon had circumnavigated everything but the right choice for the last 20 years. So I think if you look at what we've got already, let's say from the Caddy draft onwards, Caddy Roberts into the Kako draft, and then last year's haul with Roby Sharp-Farrow, I think we're probably two really good drafts. And I mean, you've got to get it right. And you've also then got to develop all this glut of players that we've pulled together over a 5-year period. But I think it's 2 years away from having that key young core that you need. My philosophy on list building is unless you're a club that's got a natural positive protective factor like a Sydney who's got academy and isolation from Melbourne media, or Geelong who's got lifestyle and pull to home. Unless you're a club that's got that, you kind of need to list build in a way that we've seen be successful. And ultimately it's about getting a core group of young talent over a 4 or 5 or 6 draft period. And then once they get to a stage where they're mature enough that, the oldest of those players are sort of at 120-ish games, you can then start to think about, well, now we can add some senior experience, free agent or trade targets. I think we're probably 2 more drafts away from even thinking about that, maybe even 3. But if we were to nail the next 2 drafts, and that would look like, and there's talks of compensation picks and new draft rules maybe benefiting us, if we were to get 3 or 4 good talents in this year, plus say a Kobe Buick, and then anyone more than Kobe Buick next year is probably a bonus given the matching rules are so steep now. But if it were to be 3 or 4 this year plus Buick and maybe a benefit of someone else after that, I think that's the young core sorted. I think then you look at maybe 2027, 2028, you start thinking about senior experienced guys that would fill really specific list needs. If you needed a really gun winger, you might go out and look for a free agent or a trade target as a winger, or it might be a key forward to pair with Caddy. But I think that's probably that 27, 28. So in terms of like a comparison, I think about Melbourne maybe in 2017. They hadn't quite got all their pieces together and they were probably 4 years away from being a really good side. I think maybe Freo looked really good this year. I think maybe where they were at in 2021, they'd kind of got their core of young players, and they were then going to just continue to add to that and then look at some senior trade targets in the next couple of years. I think that's probably where I think we are.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad position to be in, given you look at where Melbourne went from that. They made a prelim in 2019, and that arguably was ahead of schedule, and they was 2018, sorry, I'm a mistake there. And then they had a couple of years sort of having to go back a bit. And I think what they didn't do is they didn't necessarily overcommit to where they're at, which I think we've made a mistake in the past. And they kept with that draft focus and building through young talent. I think, that's what Essendon, as you said, has been doing for the Brad Scott era. And I know that the media likes to point to things like the 3 free agents that we brought in at the end of 2023, but we did that whilst protecting our draft capital. And money is a resource. Your salary cap is a resource you've got to use to try and get better, or to try and not bottom out too hard. We've seen what happens with teams that go really hard and cut all their experience, and you kind of want to avoid that. So I guess, after thinking about where we're at, what are your thoughts then on the decision Essendon's made to let go of Brad Scott at this point in the list build?
I heard you talk about it on your pod in the week after the sacking, and you expressed a sense of disappointment. And honestly, for me, it was the same. I got the message went off in the group chat that morning, and as I was walking from the car into my office at work, I saw it, and then obviously confirmed it on social media and whatnot. And I was just this sense of, we've just done it again. Like, I just felt like this is classic. Just when it felt like we'd actually said, we're not going to do this anymore, we just couldn't hold on, and we did it. And it was just such a sense of disappointment. I think there's a belief out there that I'm super pro Brad Scott because I was so pro holding the line. I was never, even when he got hired, I was never super excited by the prospect of him as a coach. I didn't know whether tactically or man management or list management or selection from what we'd seen at North Melbourne that he was the perfect option for us in that sense. But what I was always very pro was the fact that he was going to be someone who was going to be strong enough to stand up to old Essendon and say, no, the way you've done things for 20 years hasn't worked. I'm not listening to you. I'm not going to bend to the noise. I'm going to push this line and I'm going to work out what needs to change and we're going to make those changes. And we saw that, his first year, I think fans are unwilling to accept this because we've been so bad for so long. But his first year, he's not going to come in and sack everyone before having seen them, particularly given how late he was hired. So I think you've got to look at the first year as him getting a feel for, well, how does Essendon work? How have they done things here? And then comparing that to what he knew from previous experience at North Melbourne, but also from his job at the AFL where he was given free rein to look at what other clubs were doing. I think then we've seen since that first year some systemic changes. We've seen list management overhauled. We've seen strength and conditioning and high performance overhauled. We've seen lots of changes in the football department, the focus returning to football. And I think that Brad Scott was a good hire for those reasons. And that's why I was excited about the direction we're on. It felt like we'd got our ducks in a line. We'd committed to going through the draft. I know we never publicly said rebuild, but everyone could see that that's what we were doing. And it was then going to be a period of time. The hard part for Essendon is that if you embark on a rebuild today, you're at best 6 years away from seeing the fruits of it. So if you've been no good for the best part of 25 years, and then you say to people, hey, I need you to bear with me for 6 more years while we gut the place and go again and then become good, that's a hard thing to accept, especially when he won a few games in year one, similar amount of games in year two. Last year there was the injuries and obviously a lot less wins, and this year was looking pretty abhorrent. The start of this year has been poor to watch. We haven't played well at all. It's hard for fans to reconcile an improving club with, devolving game style and devolving performance. So I think that's where it was really difficult. Having said all of that, and having been pro what Scott was doing, I do have a fundamental belief that if your leadership, and in this case it's the board and the president, if they decide out loud that he's not the guy that's going to take them forwards, you can't then have a dead period of time where you're making no progress. So I think that once they'd spoken that into existence, the decision to sack him had to be made. It felt early to me. It felt a bit rushed. It felt like there was potential for destabilisation to occur. And then we had some coaches up and leave in the aftermath, and a few bits and pieces play out in the media, and obviously the James Hird spectre has loomed large. So there's a whole host of things that are not ideal about it, but I do understand why, if you'd made that decision that he wasn't the guy, that you do have to move on that and give yourself as much time to get it right post that.
Yeah, I wonder if the Carlton example of what sort of happened there over the last 12 months may have informed their choice to just go hard and go early, because obviously Carlton were not sure that Michael Voss was the person they wanted to go through with in the long term at the end of last year. And then they sort of, he was Schrodinger's coach, really, wasn't he? He was sort of neither there or here, or they didn't know whether he was going to be going from there. So, essentially, there's an argument made that they've wasted a year. Whereas with the decision that we've made is we've gone right. We've decided that he's not going to be the long-term coach. We need to find that person, regardless of the benefits of having a Brad Scott there and someone who can sort of deal with the pressure. I think he was handling the pressure pretty well of the outside noise and the like, and that had its benefits for trying to build that football program. It does again mean that we are going to be headline news again. But I also think that whatever we do, we're going to be headline news, right? We're not a small club. We're a club that generates a lot of content, a lot of news, and a lot of news that not only Essendon fans want to click on, but fans of other clubs want to click on as well. So I think regardless of what decision we made, there was going to be noise. And I think, I was saying, as I said in the pod that you referenced, again, why are we going through this again? Sacking coaches is like the bad boyfriend you can't get rid of. We keep seemingly going back to that move. But yeah, I guess now that the decision's been made, there's no use crying over spilt milk. You just got to get on and get the best person in who's going to be, your long-term coach that is going to take these young players through to hopefully build a successful club. And that's a whole of club, not just the on-field performance.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that I found interesting about the Carlton and Essendon have like mirrored each other for the last 2 decades. They had a bit of a better spike when they played off in that prelim, but they have kind of made the same mistakes over this period of time, and it's been interesting that two of the formerly biggest and strongest clubs have continually relied on what they did in the pre-professional era, and I think that's largely what's got them unstuck. In the recent one, and it's infuriated me a bit with a lot of the commentary around Essendon and a lot of people saying there's no game plan or the game plan's devolving or the players are listless, they've got no idea what they're doing. I think if you look at our list and if you look at the demographic, there's a massive amount of really young kids. There's a bit of a gap in that middle range where you need your experienced stars to be at their peak. And then we've got some older guys who, without being disrespectful, and I'm a classic Essendon fan that overvalues and overrates his own players too, they're just not guns. Right, our senior guys are not stars. They're serviceable, and in a good environment, in a good system with the right team around them, they could be very, very good AFL players. But they're not equipped to lead and handle all the weight that it is to play for Essendon at the moment. We're almost an expansion club list. We're almost. If you think about the Giants and Gold Coast when they came in, the guys that they brought in that were mature were far from world beaters. They were guys who were past their best or who were solid role players. They weren't stars. The Giants did better bringing in Ward and Davis as guys who were sort of entering their peak, and they were able to withstand quite a bit. But look at Gold Coast, Gary Ablett aside, it was Jared Harbrow and it was Campbell Brown and Carmichael Hunt. And then a whole host of kids. And we saw those sides get flogged unceremoniously for 3 or 4 years. Not like 30 or 40 points, but like 60, 70, 80, 100 points semi-regularly. And it just goes to show that if you're young, your game plan doesn't take because young guys make mistakes. One player out of position over here causes another player to react the wrong way because they're covering a spot that shouldn't be there, which makes a third young player completely second guess. I'm not meant to be to the left, but it looks like I should be, and then they make the wrong choice and the whole system falls down, and then it looks like confusion. It looks like players who don't know what they're doing. It looks like players who are hesitating instead of going for the ball or going for the man, and it looks like there's no game plan, and it falls apart very, very quickly. It's the kind of thing that, and we talked about list build before, it's the kind of thing where once that core group of young guys, Caddy 100 games, all the way down to Buick at 40 games, once that's happened, those mistakes are much less likely to occur and much more coverable. And so the game plan starts to look like a game plan. So I think the criticism of that game plan this year, whilst I agree it's looked horrible for a lot of the time that we've been playing, I think there's mitigating circumstances around our current state of our list. So I think that's an interesting point to consider as well.
Yeah, and you're right. And I think we look at the overall result in terms of margins. Like say you lose a game by 4 goals. What that could come down to is you made 4 small mistakes, or you had 4 players at 4 different points in the game make a small mistake that results in the opposition kicking a goal. When you break it down to that and you start thinking about what are the little moments that mattered, how do you limit those? And the best teams are limiting those moments at the most. Like Fremantle at the moment are making fewer mistakes than their opponents. Their players are more in tune to where they need to be on the ground. They're making better decisions with the ball in hand. Our players, you can argue strength of list, but overall, our players talent-wise are not that far below the top teams. It's just that we are making more mistakes and more mistakes with ball in hand or when we don't have the ball. Like that's what it comes down to. And those two, like on the weekend, it's arguably one mistake. We made one mistake more than Carlton did, and that meant that we had a 5-point margin. Like that, it's really small margins when you think about that. I know it seems like we're a long way off, but when you start, looking at it at the micro level, it's actually not that. It's not that hard to think that with a few small tweaks and a bit more experience, you can close that gap to those sides really quickly.
Absolutely.
I guess just continuing on with that. I guess, do you think with the decision made to let go of Brad Scott, I don't know, Andrew Welsh and Tim Roberts were really clear that they weren't deviating from a long-term plan. But I guess, do you think it's possible to sack the coach while still maintaining that long-term vision, or is bringing in a new coach really going to require a restarting of the plan where this coach can bring in the players that they want and the people around them that they want? Is this a reset, or is this sort of is this an update to the current plan?
It's a fascinating question, and I think what happens at Essendon over the next 6 months is going to really be interesting to watch from the outside looking in. I think like the clubs that do well and that are consistently strong have got really good alignment, and the alignment is list management, coaching department, high performance, strength and conditioning. All of those groups are aligned, and it means that High performance are building your athletes to play the way the coaches want them to play. Recruitment, understand the types of players that fit the needs of the list and where the gaps are going to be. And the coaches are all over the culmination of all three in terms of development and game plan and the whole lot. And so I think historically with Essendon, we've had changes in each department out of sync. You've had a coach get sacked, and so a new coach will come in, and strength and conditioning are trying to readapt to what the new coach wants. List management, and we had a similar list management team for a long time, drafting a certain way and building lists a certain way. And then all of a sudden you've got injuries because the players can't handle the new game style. So we're going to change high performance. They come in, okay, the coach wants this, that's great. We'll get our players to that level. Let's do it this way. And then performances aren't good, pressure mounts, coach gets sacked. High performance now, well, we've been building players to play this way. What's the new coach going to want? And so it does become a really important thing to get right for us now. I think what we would hope is that in the hiring process, and the club's talked about a process for the last 2 weeks, if the process doesn't say that you need to be coaching the way that our plan is set up to run, I think it's the wrong coach. So if we've embarked on 3 years of heavy drafting, this year's going to be heavy drafting again, next year's Buick, I think that the next coach needs to accept that those young guys need to be prioritised and given game time. Yes, there needs to be support put around them. There needs to be some senior bodies around to take heavy roles and all that kinds of stuff. But I do think that we need to make sure we have someone who is committed to building this list organically and not coming in and going, hey, I see you've got 8 awesome talents. I'm going to go out and get 3 free agents who are going to fill some holes, and we're going to go and we're going to finish like St Kilda are going to go this year and probably finish in the wildcard round and get stuck there for the next 10 years.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's a decision we've made a couple of times over the past few seasons, and this is where we've ended up when we have decided to strip it back. We've got to go right down to the bottom because we haven't been brave enough to commit to something for long enough before changing direction. So even with a new coach, as you said, I agree that it needs to be built on that long-term vision. And to be fair, even if you did get in a new coach this year, given where we're going to finish, I don't think we're going to have any other option other than going to the draft. I mean, what sort of players are going to want to come here? You're certainly not going to get Zach Butters interested. Zach Bailey, might have been interested at some stage last year, but he's probably looking elsewhere now. And then anyone else that you want to bring in, you're going to have to spend heaps of draft capital on, which we desperately need to get that young talent in. So I think regardless of who we get in as a coach, they're probably going to be locked into, that going through the draft for this year. And then obviously next year with Tasmania, we are shielded a little bit from there, influenced by the fact we've got the NGA players and Buick, although it might be difficult to match all of them. So I think for the most part, it's almost locked in. We have to go this way. There's almost no other option, regardless of who you get in as coach.
I actually think you're right, and I think part of what, and I probably should have said this before, I think the idea of out of necessity to beat Tasmania, we need to be poor again this year, and we need to be poor again next year to match bids that we need to take players in. So I think, we probably have cut this rebuild very fine given Tassie's coming in and they're impacting the next draft. So I think that's probably going to mean that a coach will come in with that mentality. I'm working on a piece that's going to come out sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks on the idea of a rebuilding coach, that they often don't make it and what the reasons are for that. They might do the heavy lifting, but then they're the one that gets cut before another coach comes in and finishes the job. And there's a whole host of reasons why that's the case. I just hope that Brad Scott is that for us. He went in, did the grunt work, the heavy lifting, and then whether it would have worked or not, the club's made the decision that it wouldn't, and the next person can come in and just put the finishing touches on this list build and take the side to where it needs to be.
Yeah. I guess just thinking about where we're at now and in essence decision on going with a new coach, for you, what's the best case scenario going from here? And then what's the worst case?
I think the best case is that we get a coach who is going to be able to handle everything that Essendon's a unique club in that there's a lot of noise around it. It generates clicks in the media. There's a lot of power brokers behind the scenes that look for influence. There's a storied history at the club. So there is, a lot of culture that needs to be respected and understood. So they need to be able to do all of that, but they also need to be up to date with modern football. For a long time, we've allowed our players, when it gets tough or when the game plan uptake isn't there, we've allowed them to get away with, well, let's simplify it and let's make it really basic. And ultimately that's never going to be successful against the really good sides at the point end of the season. You need to play sophisticated modern football to really compete. And I think we need someone who is going to be able to articulate the complexity of a game plan to the list in a way where they can pick it up and deliver on it. I think that's a really important thing. So communication, passion, understanding, people management, but also the modern game. And I think someone who has at least, if not them, then the people around them have seen modern day success. I think a lot of, and it's hard to say because it's my club and I love Essendon, but there's not many people who are from Essendon that have seen modern success. People will point to Damien Hardwick as an example of an Essendon person, but Damien Hardwick also went to Port Adelaide and finished his career there and won a flag there. Damien Hardwick's been away from Essendon for the best part of 17, 18 years. There's a significant period of time that separates him from Essendon. So I don't know that I would truly consider him, whilst he's definitely an Essendon person and he's an Essendon champion and he's had great playing success with us, I wouldn't say he's purely an Essendon person. And I think that probably leads me into what's the worst case. The worst case for us now is that we revert to old Essendon, where we don't warm to the possibility of outsiders. We bunker down, we go insular, and we really go back to, well, how did we win flags pre-2000? Let's try that, because that's what we know works, and that's the only thing we've ever seen work. And I think if we were to go back into that and become really Essendon-centric and cut out the ways of thinking that the rest of the competition has developed in this modern professional game, I think that would be a bad way to go about things.
Yeah, indeed. That sort of brings me to my next point. And to paraphrase The Simpsons, it seems that James Hird's campaign seems to have the momentum of a runaway freight train. I guess, in your view, is it too much a risk to go back down that path? Or is it simply the case that since he's always going to be one of the great what-ifs at Essendon, until he gets another chance with him simply existing, is that a destabilising force around the club that we can't move past until we find out definitively one way or another whether he can be a successful coach?
I'm so torn on this, and I will openly admit that part of it is my 12-year-old Essendon fanboy. James Hird was my idol. There's got to be a little bit of inherent bias there. I accept that, but my initial response when I saw him live interviewed by Maguire on national TV was, I don't know if that's the answer for us. But then I listened to him speak, and I don't begrudge anything he said. I think he presented brilliantly. He said all the right things. He was respectful of the need for a process. He was respectful of the need for Essendon to make the best choice. And then the more I've sort of consumed both sides of the argument, and I like to think that when it comes to Essendon, I can be pretty pragmatic. I like to think that I can step back from the emotion of it. The more I let it sit with me, the more I think he might be the only person, given the recent period of time, that could stabilise the environment. He might be the only person who has the gravitas to come in and tell board members and coterie groups and former players and people in the media who are Essendon people to just sit back and give us time. I think no one else is going to be afforded that level of internal support. So I think that's a tick in his column. I think he clearly has a passion for Essendon, and I think that he will have learnt a lot from his first stint. And I also think that the argument that he's been out of the game as long as he has is a bit of a misnomer. I think, I wrote a Herd article in the week after his interview, and in my research for that, it became very apparent that not that he was gunning for Brad Scott to get the sack, but he's been preparing for a second chance for a long time. He's been doing a lot of work in the background to make sure that he is as close to the cutting edge as you can be without being in clubland. The issue that people will have with that is that, well, if you really wanted to coach, why haven't you gone and assistant coached at a different club? And I accept that as a valid point too. But I think the idea that he's unprepared is false. And I certainly think that he believes he's the best person to take on the job. And the other side of it is too that people are always going to have, and you mentioned this before, the what if. He's always going to be the great hope and the great, well, what could have been had the saga not happened. And until he gets the chance to do that, I think that will never go away until he is beyond coaching capability with age and that kind of stuff. So I think there's an element of, we almost need to consider biting the bullet on it and going, we might need to get through this. We might need to give him the chance. And then the reason why I'm so torn is that I think either way could work or either way could fail. Herd could come in, be exactly what the club needs right now, lead us out of where we are, and what a redemption story that would be. By the same token, the noise around Essendon could be far too intense. The saga stuff would come back up. He may have been out of the game for too long. It may not work, and then that would be quite disastrous. It would be, a big hole that's wasted 3 or 4 years having him back. The same token, a new coach could have the same situation. They might come in, like many new coaches do, fresh ideas, fresh energy, have a spike in performance, articulate a modern game plan and be successful. But a new coach might also have the same issues that Ben Rutten had, where no one quite takes to him. He doesn't have the same support at board level or in the back scenes behind the club, and the bottom falls out before he can even get going. So it's just such a bizarre circumstance that we find ourselves in, where I think where I've got to is if there's an ever so slight tilt, it's towards Herd at this point.
Yeah, I was a bit like you in terms of being. I started off being against it, and as I've sort of thought about it more, I'm probably at Herd agnostic point right now. I sort of feel that the idea that the head coach has to be the one that is setting setting everything about the game plan is a real throwback to sort of 80s, 90s football, where you didn't have the support networks around, and the way in which football departments are structured so much has changed so much since that time. And I think a lot of people, media and fans as well, sort of get stuck on what was the thinking like 10, 20, 30 years ago. This is what worked then. This is what's going to work now. But as you say, it has changed so much. And I think even if you accept the fact that Herd is not at the cutting edge of modern coaching and the cutting edge of modern tactics, there's more to being a head coach than just being the one who does the tactics and sets, the game plan. You have support staff for that. And I think if let's say, for example, if Herd coming on meant that he would bring, say, a Brendan McCartney, who has got an excellent track record developing players in successful systems like Geelong, did a lot of work developing those Bulldogs players with Beveridge sort of putting the finishing pieces on to get them to a flag. It's hard not to read into Jimmy Bartell starting to really start talking about what Essendon needs to do from here, to not also see that as a bit of a job interview. And I think he's someone who's really highly rated as a football brain and did a lot of good work at the Giants. So I guess if you're right. A herd could work if it is with the right support networks around him, and the club would need to make sure that they have those supports in place so that you could deal with you could amplify Herd's strengths and overcome his weaknesses. If you think about it, it's a football equivalent of what Richmond did with Dustin Martin. So Dustin Martin was an attacking football savant, but wasn't prepared to do, or wasn't capable of doing the defensive actions. But what do you do? Do you try and make Dustin Martin defend and take away from his offensive capability, or do you put in place pieces around him that means he can be one of, if not the best attacking midfielders that we've seen probably since peak Chris Judd? So that's where I'm at with Herd. I just hope that there is a full process, and it's not a boat race, or that they haven't set parameters that skew too heavily one way or the other. If Herd goes through a full process and comes out the side and he's recommended as the coach for Essendon going forward, I think I'll be pretty satisfied with that.
Yeah, and you make a fantastic point about the idea of the coaching hire is as much about the ticket as it is about the main man. And I think the speculation around who Herd's been talking to and what a team might look like, I think that's very exciting. You look at some of those names and their history in the game and their IP from different environments and different clubs and their strengths, and their abilities to connect and interact with each other, I think looks really promising. And then you talk about the Herd strengths. Well, he's that brilliant communicator. He can make the complex seem simple. He can unite people. He's a real motivator. And I think that in that dream scenario where the ticket is right, I think there's a world where he does present his case as being the best option going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we still don't know what the process is going to look like. It looks like that'll still take a couple of weeks before that's in place. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come out in that space. But look, the main reason I got you on, I was wanting to get you on, was to talk about AFL list management and what to do and the mistakes that the teams make. More of a holistic thing than just focusing on Essendon. We're over 40 minutes now, and we're finally getting to the main reason I got you on. But I just wanted to sort of pick your brain on a few different aspects of list management, because I think it's the decisions that teams make at different points of their cycle are really interesting, and what factors they consider and when they decide to go or when they decide to change paths. So I guess, I'm just going to throw a few ideas at you, and we'll just sort of break them down. So I guess thinking about teams that have been successful, have been up around the top, you've seen teams, and we're probably seeing it with Collingwood now, and having to make a choice about what they do, having been so successful for a long period of time. I guess is how do you think teams should be able to decide when they need to double down on their team's list and when you should be prepared to embrace the rebuild? So I sort of think about in recent history, we've got Hawthorn after their three-peat, they doubled down, they went and got Tom Mitchell and Jager O'Meara and really tried to keep up around the top with the premiership players they had around them. You have Richmond with Hopper and Taranto a couple of years after their last premiership. I mean, we've seen how well that's worked out for them. They have been able to pivot back to the draft pretty rapidly, but they had to give up a lot to do that. And I compare that to sort of what's happening with Melbourne right now. So they won their flag in 2021, and they pretty quickly, went straight back to the draft. I think from 2023, they were taking 2 first-round picks a year. I might be a year earlier than that, but they looked at their list and decided that they really wanted to double down on getting that young talent in so they could have a sustained period. So I guess thinking about sort of those concepts, when do you think is the right time, and when do you think teams start sending good money after bad?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, and I think it's why list managers are so important to football clubs because, essentially they are living and dying by these choices. It sounds really ruthless, but I think the moment that you think your list is capped with your current talent and likely ability to draft or bring in free agents, you need to make a choice. And the choice has got to be one of two things. You've got to do like what you were alluding to earlier, the idea of really doubling down and getting some quality talent. And clubs like Geelong, they've got the benefit of, the go-home factor and the lifestyle stuff, but they've been able to consistently every couple of years bring in a genuine star to really keep that side strong and replace the aging veterans and bring some new life and zest. You think about Jeremy Cameron coming in and now got Bailey Smith, and they've consistently been able to bring in Dangerfield as well. Those kinds of players that really do, they're top liners. So the choice is either that or the choice is our only option here is to really hit the draft hard for the next 3 or 4 years. And in doing so, you need to think about, well, which assets do we have that we can shed for capital? They have to be guys that aren't going to be there when this young core comes on, but they still need to be young enough to have value. So if you think about Richmond sending Shai Bolton and Rioli, now I know those players wanted to leave as well, so it was a bit of a perfect storm for the Tigers, but they were able to maximise getting a lot of picks in at the early stage post their success. And I think they had just got to the point where they thought this list is going to get stale. We're going to lose our 5 megastars, Cochin, Rance, Riewoldt, Martin, and probably Edwards. They're all going to drop off. And if you take out that core fundamental pieces of our side, we're not going to be competitive. We're going to get stuck in no man's land in that mid-period of the table. Even with our other talented guys and even getting picks around the 8, 9, 10 range, we'll add talent, but we'll get stuck there. So they made a clear and deliberate choice to shed assets, bring in draft capital. And as a result of doing that, you inherently play worse because you're a younger side. And so then your team goes towards the bottom and you get more access to talent. So you get both. You get to expose your players to AFL situations, develop them faster, but then you also get to bring the talent in. So I think the simple answer is, as a list management department, the moment that you think your list is capped, you've got to go one way or the other. You can't just tread time stuck in this, let's just see how it goes. We'll just take our natural draft pick. We won't trade anyone. We won't move our draft hand earlier. We'll just play it by nature. Because if you just play it by nature, you kind of bob up and down between 7th and 12th.
Yeah, indeed. And I think just thinking more, we've seen Brisbane in the last year, they've gone and got free agents and tried to keep, I think they're a different case because they've brought in so much academy talent that they probably can afford to do that. And that academy talent is on, minimum contracts at the moment. So they've sort of got the cap space to do it, but we are seeing some players get pushed out of that list. So it'll be interesting, to judge what they've done in, say, 3 or 4 years. Was it the right call to go and get Oscar Allen and Sam Draper, or is that hamstrung them for the future? I think you would think with the amount of young talent they've got on that list, they're going to be okay, but it is going to be one of those potential sliding doors. And I use that in its correct terminology, not like a certain AFL media personality moment where you look at the choice that they made to do that. How is that going to affect them in the long term? And again, we don't know about these choices. I think, you could have looked at Richmond in 2017 or the 2016 postseason, going out and getting Caddy and Prestia and then Curvis and saying, well, that could have been a moment where, they've overblown it, but obviously that worked out for them. And I guess that sort of brings me on to our next point. You look at a team like Richmond, and before they did that, they'd made 3 finals in 3 years and lost each of them. Then they missed the finals, and there would have been a case to be made that they'd had their crack with this list, and they need to go back down the ladder. But they went for the options of bringing in those players and identifying the areas that they needed, and obviously that really paid off for them. It certainly wasn't only a list management reason why they shot up the ladder. There were other factors at play. But then you compare that to, say, what Essendon did post 2017 with the Sard, Stringer, Smith, Shield acquisitions, and then what St Kilda have done this past off season. Obviously, it's a bit early to really judge how successful St Kilda is going to be with it, but these are the sort of decisions that teams make that end up costing them in the long run, because they haven't made the correct assessment of where their list is actually at, and it hurts them in the long term.
Yeah, I think once you've decided to build your list through the draft and getting young talent in, the biggest mistake you can make is rising too quickly. You know, you need to allow that organic. You're a young side, you've bottomed out, you're going to finish down the bottom as those young players develop. But the flip side is that not only do you get to expose them to AFL intensity and development, but you also get access to better talent. And that allows you to have those 3, 4, 5 drafts in a row where you really add that core young talent. I look at St Kilda, and Wanganeen Miller aside, they haven't gone down, well, and he was a pick 13, so he's obviously a really good drafting choice, but they haven't gone down and really accessed enough high-end talent for mine. Bringing in these 3 players is going to make them a better side. They're going to be more structured, they're going to have more senior bodies who can compete harder for longer, and they're going to win more games by having those 3 guys that they brought in. As a result, they're going to finish high up the ladder, further away from the talent that they need, and ultimately their list will be capped. There will be an inability for them to get beyond what they've currently got talent-wise, and so that's going to mean that if that means that they stop at 6th on the ladder, well, they're going to rise to 6th and then they're going to bob back down to 13, and they're going to get stuck in that period of the ladder where you don't get better and you don't really get worse. You just kind of get stuck. And that's where Essendon's been. You mentioned the 4 S's and that sort of 2017 period. That was classic overvaluing the young talent that we had, topping up and then pushing forwards, but it was the wrong mix. You know, adding Shield to a small midfield group was just the wrong play. He added another competitive player that could play at the level, but he didn't allow to get in a young kid who had different attributes that could have been developed to fit in with our midfield group. And so I think clubs need to be really careful of not rising too quickly, and that's a hard message to sell to fans. I think that's you know, you look at St Kilda, a club with limited premiership success, and then they want to attract players to their club. They've got money to spend, but if they're not winning and they're not competitive, that becomes much harder to sell memberships, harder to sell your club to prospective players, to coaches. And so have they made a decision to not win a flag to ultimately make their club more appealing in the here and now, to hopefully then be able to spike up down the track with a better reputation? Maybe that's what their decision making is about. But in terms of purely going from a rebuilding club to the top of the ladder and winning a flag, I think the biggest danger is rising too quickly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when teams are making these decisions, it's always justifiable, right? And I think back to 2017, we made the choice to go for Sard, Stringer and Smith. We were coming off a season where we burst back into finals. We had, you know, players like Hurley and Hooker as bookends. You had Joe Danaher really have his breakout year, All Australian. Had Farazia Fantasia, looks like a gun small forward. I mean, I think about that 2017 forward line and how well that functioned. And you think about, you know, Dyson Heppel hadn't really started to come down with his injuries. He was still playing good midfield time. So I think there was an element there where it could have been the right decision, right? But I think the big issue for me was the doubling down on the Shield one. So we basically went 3 draft periods where we didn't invest in top-end talent. And then when we finally were forced to invest in top-end talent, we ended up with the COVID draft, which obviously Zach Reid is finally back and performing to what he was capable of. Perkins, at the least, I think is going to be a good role player as our half forward. And then, you know, I think Nick Cox is more likely not to be delisted at the end of this year. But we bottomed out at the worst time. As you sort of said earlier, we sort of bottom out just in time at the moment, because we're doing it before Tasmania comes in. And even last year, with the players that we've picked up, I know Jared Waitley's big on you need top 5 picks. I think that the picks that we've got and what they've shown so far, we've done really well from that previous draft. But you're right. I think there's elements where the choices, like every choice has branching paths, right? And I think there was a world where the choices we made after 2017 could have worked, but they're also short-term decisions, right? They weren't building for the long term. And it's the thing Essendon really hasn't done probably for 20, 25 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think that idea of having a really stable base before you add to the roof is key. And I think that a lot of these decisions that we've spoken about in the last sort of 5 or so minutes are clubs that have gone to the roof before the base was set.
Yeah, indeed. I guess you actually sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but, you know, maybe this is just the poor Essendon fan in me, but it's the worst place in football to be right now, an underperforming Melbourne-based club in terms of attracting talent to your club. You look at the Western Australian, the South Australian clubs, they've both got go-home factors where they're only competing with one other side if a player wants to move to that state. You've got the northern clubs having their academies, which giving them priority access to talent. You've got Geelong, which is the best of all worlds, being in Victoria, but also has that distinct lifestyle advantage. And obviously is a very well-run club. It has been for 25 years. I guess if you're a player that wants to play in Victoria and you want to play for a Melbourne club, you've actually got 9 to choose from. And I guess as an S perspective, why would high-level talent pick Essendon, which is not performing and doesn't look like going to be performing for a while? So, yeah, I guess it's a hard cycle to get out of, really. You look at what's happened with North Melbourne and how much they've struggled, even when they've had millions of dollars in their salary cap to get players. The best they could attract was like a Jared Polek or something along those lines. So, yeah, I think it is a hard place to be in, and there's only real one way out, which is to sort of draft your way out of it.
I think you're right. I think it's 100% true. Those struggling Melbourne clubs, all they have to offer is money. They will have salary cap because they don't have the stars to be paying all their money to. So by virtue of that, they should have salary cap space. But as a professional who wants to be part of a successful environment, unless you're completely motivated by money, it's not going to be enough. I think a club like Essendon would be hoping that in 2 more drafts time, adding potentially pick 1 or 2 this year and a few more talents, and then someone like a Kobe Buick next year, who I think is a very high-end talent, I think you would then have at least the portfolio to say, hey, this is our young list. This is where we project to be in 3 years' time. And you would be this player in amongst this system. And I think then you can at least sell a vision. But unless you've got that core group of young players that you've already drafted and put together that are looking like they could be worthwhile, I think you're on a highway to nothing. It's a very difficult place to attract talent to, I think.
Yeah, indeed. So we as I said earlier, we sort of are forced to commit to that draft first strategy where we're at if we want to eventually get to where we want to be, which is that long-term successful club that's consistently competing for premierships. And we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but we'll circle back to the Bombers. And I guess let's assume or slash hope that whoever the new coach is going to commit to that draft first strategy. I guess how many more years of talent acquisition do you think Essendon needs before it can start looking at being aggressive in trade or free agency?
I think if we nail the next 2 drafts, I think if we do a good job, and Rose's drafting record, albeit very short, has been very impressive. He's got a clear type of player that there are some non-negotiables in terms of things like competitiveness, running power, some physicality, and there's been a lean towards foot skills, which we maybe haven't appreciated as much in previous eras. So I think there's some really good attributes that we're honing in on. We've also had a good spread of plays in the last 3 drafts, different positional needs and different shapes and sizes and attributes that fit together. So I think there's certainly a plan in the way that we're drafting. If you think about, we're going to have a very early pick this year, pick 1 or 2. We are going to have a very early second-round pick. There's talk about potentially an assistance package, which might have us get an end of first-round pick and some extra rookie spots. And there's the new draft bid matching rules whereby if our first-round pick in the top 5 is pushed back by a match bid, then we'll get a second-round selection coming in as well. So we could, for all intents and purposes, have 4 top 22, 23 picks at the end of the year, plus an academy kid in Blake Justice, who I'm quite high on. So I think if we got 3 or 4 good talents out of that, one of those you'd hope is going to be a megastar, that pick 1 or 2, and then another 2, 3, potentially 4 really good players, really top-end sort of players. And then you add Kobe Buick, who, as I mentioned before, I'm really big on. I think he's a super talent, and I think he's really a piece that we don't have, a really classy, aggressive ball user, penetrative by foot, running power, smart running patterns, a really nice, agile, zippy piece that we don't have. I think if you add that sort of 4 or 5 players to our list with what we've recently drafted, plus that, I suppose, middling group, that sort of Zach Reed, Nick Martin, Durham, Caldwell as the senior types to that young core, I think post-Buick we can start potentially looking at free agents. Now, if we were really bad again in Buick's first year, so that would be 2028, that's Tassie's first year, you may go, well, we've got an early pick. Tassie's only got 2 picks in that draft that push our picks back, so we might have access to an early talent. You might go 1 more and get another really high-end young kid in. But if you spiked on the back of the next 2 drafts and it looked good, you then really start thinking about, well, who are the gun free agents in roles that we don't have. If we haven't managed to find a partner for Nate Caddy, is there a gun key forward that we can bring in and pair with him so that that forward line's rounded off? Is there a gun small forward if we haven't had any of ours come on the way we'd like, fill that hole? So that kind of thing I think could be happening in the years post Kobe Buick.
Yeah, indeed. Well, look, I'm going to sort of get you to think about the end of this year and what do you think Essendon's dream draft and trade period looks like at the end of 2027?
So at us getting pick 1 or 2 is going to be a star player. I'm probably leaning towards pick 1 will be ours, and that's Harry Van Hadem. He's the generational ruck. He's big and strong like a Darcy, but he's agile and athletic like a Jackson. So he's a really unique prospect. Good foot skills, power, aggression, athleticism. And if you think about a centre square in a few years' time of Van Hadem, Roby, Sharp and Farrow, with guys like Martin and Buick rolling through there for class, I think it's a really awesome centre square setup for the modern game. If we were pick 2, you'd look at one of those really damaging forward half mid types like an Archie Butler or a Gus Teixeira. You may look at a Clancy Snell if his national championships is awesome. He's a really high-end key defender. He's ranked at about 6 or 7 on my rankings at the moment, but if his national champs are really good, he might spike up and you may consider him that early. But then for us, you think about, I just mentioned before, those 3 other picks inside 23, we'd be looking at some pretty good talent there. Someone like a Darcy Sherjan. He's a Tom Stewart type third tall defender, provides really good lockdown, but also rebound ability. And with the talks and the noise around Jordan Ridley being pretty significant towards him leaving, I think that's the kind of player that we want to bring in. Someone like a Marlon Neocleus, I think people have got him around 10. I think he's probably more around the 20 mark. He's like Nick Watson light. He's not quite as explosive, not quite as agile, not quite as damaging. Probably a little bit better defensively, but probably not quite the same elite talent as Watson. So I can see him being available around that mark, and he's that really small creative half forward that we could use. Someone like a Mitch Harris is an intercepting key back. We've got some doubts around the long-term future of Mackay. Zach Reed's injury history counts against him. Lewis Hayes, obviously the second ACL. So I think another young key defender is probably something we'd look at, and there's a few in this draft. And then you've got Blake Justice, who's, for those that don't know, he's a NGA prospect for us. He's a 190 centimetre elite athlete. So his power, speed, agility stuff is off the charts. He played as centre square mid in his bottom age year for Calder. So he's got demonstrated ability to play in that key role. He's not just an outside type. He does go through. He's very competitive, loves the crash and bash, even though he's got a slight frame at this stage. Hasn't played yet this year. So his draft ranking's a bit uncertain. We're not sure where he's going to go. He's just going to come back and he's going to play his first game for the year this weekend. I could see him being bid on around 20, but if he doesn't get back to the form he showed last year, there's potentially he slides. So we'll need to get some intel on him, whether we need to use one of those early second round picks or whether he'll slide long enough for us to be able to match a bid later. And then the other part to our off season that I think's worth exploring is, I mentioned Ridley sounds like he's going. We'll be able to get something in for him. I don't think it'll be a super high-end something for him, but I think we'll be able to get something of value for him. And there's obviously the talk around Zach Merritt and him wanting to leave and Hawthorn still being interested, and a few other parties starting to sniff around given that Hawthorn weren't able to get the deal done last year. So if we can bring in some picks for those two, I can see, some more talent around those marks being looked at. I can see us looking to flick picks into the future so we can help matching bids on Buick, but also some other NGAs for next year. So I think Rose will get creative with what he does in regards to our pick flicking forwards and back and trying to make us have enough points where we need them. And I think we're at the point now where you don't want to cut too many, but if you got a really good offer, and it would have to be an offer that turns our head for them, but a good offer for someone like a Langford or a Parrish, even a Redmond. I know they're our senior and more experienced and our better players currently, but if you got an offer that was going to really benefit our list build, I think you'd have to consider it. You'd have to look at it. The only player I'd look to bring in would be someone like a Jed Walter. There's been a bit of talk about that. I know they've offered him a big deal since the Essendon chat came out. But if you could involve Jed Walter in a deal for Ridley, for example, he's keen to get to Gold Coast. If you can involve something there where we weren't losing too many of our assets, I think you'd look at that because he could be someone that would be a nice foil for Caddy. I think they've both got speed, power, athleticism, aggression, and they've both got reasonably good defensive application. So I can see them working well as a couple of deep forward options.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how things do play out. And you're right there about I think just thinking about where we're at now and where the rest of the competition is at now, I can't see us getting out of the bottom two, right? Like I think we're 3 games behind the team that's currently in 16th. And so you are looking at a one or pick 2. And I know people are really excited about Harry Van Hatten, but I think a lot of those players that are in around the 2 range are players who are really exciting and could make a big difference for us. And you're right about the older players. We're probably going to lose a couple, and you don't want to. I know people get frustrated with the way in which they perform on a week-on-week basis, and they're part of the reason why we are at the level that we're at. But you're right, you can't get rid of all of them at once, and then you're really in struggle town. Well, look, I did pose one question to you right after my first set of questions, and I'm going to give you the keys to the AFL, Tommy, given how you've thought about list management and the AFL as a general. I guess, let's say you were put in charge. What changes would you make to list rules and then to drafting and trading?
It's really interesting that you pose this question because it got released this morning that the AFL is sort of canvassing all the club leaders for a bit of a look at the whole structure of the way the AFL is set up. So it was interesting that sort of come out at the same sort of time. There's a few things I'd look at doing. I'm big on exposing. So I know people question if there's enough talent for 18, 19, 20 teams. I'm big on exposing more players to the elite systems and the elite environments. So I would look at having, and I've heard you talk about it and I agree wholeheartedly, I'm big on minimum list sizes. So in the sense that not having small list sizes, but having a minimum requirement. You have to have this many, but beyond that, go for your life. If you can pay them with your salary cap, go for your life. So I like the idea of having a minimum of 40 senior listed players. I think if you're a club that's right in the window and you want to pay a few more megastars more money, you stop at 40 and you pay your players well for what they're doing. If you're a developing club that needs to throw more darts at the board, then you should be able to pay your players less. Don't get sucked into overpaying young talent before they're ready, but also have an extra 8 guys on your list. If you can afford to pay 50 players to be on your senior list and have more guys in the system showing their wares, fighting for spots, developing, improving, and showing talent that you might not have otherwise uncovered, then I think that should be a free-for-all for those clubs if they choose to do so. So I think I'd have a minimum of 40 senior listed players. I'd also have, because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking the AFL needs a national reserves comp. We can't be having this hybrid model where you've got some clubs playing in this comp with these rules, some clubs playing this comp. This comp's got 21 sides and there's 15 buys for the season, and this comp's got AFL players split amongst these sides, and like it's all over the place. So in the back of my mind, I've got the need for an AFL reserves comp, which for me means that we need more players on AFL lists. So I would then have a list of 20, you can call them rookies because that's what people are comfortable with. I'd call it a supplementary list. You got rolling 1-year deals for up to 20 players that you can sign post-draft. You can draft them if you want. I don't mind how the mechanism is. That probably I need to think about. But that would give you a minimum of 60 players on your list that you can pick week to week. I'd say those guys are eligible for senior selection. So if they're killing it and you want to pick them in your senior side and then offer them a 3-year deal at the end of the year, awesome, brilliant. But that gives you 60 starting players with which to field your 2 sides every week. There's obviously cases like Essendon and Richmond in the last couple of years where the injury crisis has been significant and you wouldn't be able to field 2 sides even if you had 60 players. I think we probably need to then look at realigning how our state leagues and our underage pathways fit. So I think there'd be a whole realignment of, Coates Talent League and South Australian Sandful under-18s and Waffle under-18s. And I'd think about your state league comps, the VFL, the Waffle, the Sandful, depending on what Queensland, New South Wales want to do, whether they want to stay attached to the VFL or run their own Northern States competition. Have your junior talent pathways tied into those clubs so that there's AFL money put into your state league clubs. They're getting the benefits of that, but also the underage guys are getting that development pathway as well. I'd have your AFL players, if you've got too many for the weekend, they can spill over into an aligned club. And also, if you haven't got enough because of injuries, you can give these top-end under-18s players, they can be aligned to AFL clubs for that underage year, whereby they can get exposure at senior AFL reserves level. So what that would mean is that you'd get to see them playing against the reserves comp. You'd see those players exposed. You'd have more intel on how they handle physicality, the speed, all that kind of stuff. And that would be a good development thing for those under-18s as well. So that's kind of how I would look at modifying the list rules. I think there's obviously a little bit there that needs some fleshing out and needs some explanation. And there's obviously the money that goes into that. Obviously, you need more development coaches to deal with more players. You need to think about what your salary cap looks like. How much are you paying those supplementary players to make it worth their while to only be on a 1-year deal? I get that there's a whole lot to wrestle with, but I think the AFL has historically been kind of like that family renovation where you bought a house and, the back room needed to be done. So you patch that one up and it looks really good now, but it doesn't really match the lounge room. So, 10 years later, you fix the lounge room and that matches, but now the bedrooms, there's not enough because you've had a few kids and there's a dog trampling through here and you've got to fix the backyard. I think the AFL's kind of done that. We've just gone from VFL to AFL and we've just kept patching holes in the walls. So I think there's obviously a bit to flesh out in a dream scenario where you could restart it. I'd have list sizes in that method that I described.
Yeah, I agree. As you say, it's something I've spoken about a bit on the show, that I get why the lists are the way they are, right? I think it's the influence of the Players Association, right? They want to keep salaries high for the players they're in, and I understand where they're coming from, but I think from a club perspective, it does hurt you, because then you have to. And the other thing that I think hurts clubs a lot is that cap space minimum, or the minimum they have to pay, because you've got situations where clubs are forced to pay, mid-range players top range rates, and then that skews what you can do in the future. You can't bank salary cap room to really go all out and blow a team out of the water for a free agent, like we're seeing with what Richmond is trying to do with Zach Butters at the moment. The list rules make it a lot harder for a team to find other ways of getting up the ladder other than through drafting. So yeah, what about in terms of trading and other aspects of the list build would you look to change?
Obviously, the trade period generates the most clicks of anything in football, so there's a lot of fascination with player movement. I think there's a few mechanisms that we probably need to look at a little bit, not so much around trade specific, but around the other player movement mechanisms. I'll start kind of with NGA Northern Academies. People are against them. I think they're great. I think they've led to a massive development spike, particularly in the Gold Coast. Auskick numbers are higher than, the equivalent rugby version up in Gold Coast for the first time ever. It's got to be on the back of the Gold Coast Suns and their academy, the amount of numbers of kids they're putting through there, and they're generating talent that way. So it's fantastic. I think that you need to make sure that clubs pay for them, so we don't have what happened last year where Gold Coast gets 5 kids for a packet of twisties. We don't want that. And by the same token, I love the father-son. I think that romanticism and uniquely Australian aspect is good. I just think you should have to pay for those kids. So I think the new system around bid matching is good. I think there should be some thoughts around free agency and tiering it a little bit different. So I would look at something, and again, this needs fleshing out, and I'm sure that there'll be people who point holes in it everywhere, but I'd look at first-round draftees being on a 4-year deal. I want to encourage clubs to have a good chunk of time to develop and win players over. I think 6 years, I would look at restricted free agency that has compensation. So if you lose a kid early, 6 years into their career, there's some form of compensation. I would look at 8-year free agency being, again, restricted, but with no compensation. So if you do lose a restricted free agent after their 8 years of service, there's no compo. And I'd look at 10 years remaining at unrestricted free agency. But I'd also look at, in amongst all that, adding in the fact that if a player is leaving before restricted free agency, before their 6th year, they can't nominate a club. They can say, I want to leave. I need to get out of Essendon. I need to go. But in making the choice to leave, Essendon can look for the best, highest bidder and trade them to that club that's going to remunerate Essendon the most. So I think that needs to be something that comes in. I think that clubs get hamstrung by, I'm only going to the Premier and they've only got pick 18. So you'll have to accept the next 3 pick 18s because they're going to be a good side with me going there. And I think that makes it really hard for clubs to do that. I'd also look at a few other things around free agency, like this idea of bid matching. I think in its initial iteration, it was meant to be that if a club matched the bid, then the player got what they wanted. They were looking for the market to suggest what they were worth and get what they were worth. And if that meant at their new club or at their old club, they got remunerated the way they wanted. So I think that we would need a system, or I'd like a system where if a club matches a free agency offer, then there's no trade. There's no, we match it and force a trade. No, we matched it, you stay here. So I think that should come in. I also think that to stop the shenanigans around will they or won't they match the bid, I think if a club's going to match a bid, they should have to have put forward a contract offer prior to free agency. If there's no offer, then so that they've put their stake in the ground. So that would mean that if no clubs offer a free agency a bid, the club pays them what their offer was. If a club offers more money, they can match it and keep their player, or they can say, no, we were only going to offer what our contract was, you can leave. So I think that it just stops then clubs from going, oh no, we're threatening to match, and then we'll force a trade, so you have to give us picks, more than one pick. I think that combined with removing compensation for 8-year restricted free agents and on, I think that would alleviate this whole game around let's generate compensation, let's manufacture a result, let's try and rort the system so we can get some more picks out of ultimately what should be about players testing the market to see what they're worth and then getting paid what the market says they're worth.
Yeah, we've sort of got a bit of a hybrid system, haven't we? We've sort of tried to, we want to be the NBA or NFL so bad, right? But we're held back by, tradition. We're held back by the power that the clubs have or the power that the Players Association has in regards to setting what the rules are. And yeah, it is, as you say. I really liked your analogy of the house that's had small renovations over previous years, and I think if this thing the AFL has called for is legitimate, we might see wholesale changes. Although, given what we've gone through here, like they can sort of put the drafting and trading and list size panels off, because I think we've solved it there. Well, look, Tommy, huge thanks to you for coming on the show tonight. I could have you on for another hour, I reckon, picking your brain. But yeah, I think we've all got lives that we've got to get on with. So I've certainly enjoyed the time talking with you, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. Any final words from you? And again, just remind everyone where they can find your work.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've loved being on the show. It's been a great chat. You've been fantastic to have a chat with, and I'm happy to chat footy with you anytime. If people are interested in reading the play, it's a little blog of mine, readingtheplay.wordpress.com. You can find all my articles and draft content there. I'm on X as well, so at Tommy_Wolfe7, and Reading the Play's got a handle as well, but that's all available on the website. So if you want to jump on and have a look, that'll be awesome. If not, don't stress, I'm all good.
Well, I definitely recommend that you guys, listeners, check out Tommy's work, and there'll be a link to Reading the Play in the description of this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. If you continue to support the show, and until next time, stay safe and go Dons.